So it's worthwhile reading this. I don't normally recommend boxes, because if you read a box, it means that you're already looking at the summaries of the detail, and the questions are in the detail, not in the summaries. But this is quite a useful page to learn. There may be questions which actually would say infrastructure refers to public works, and then it will say, what are these? And the answer would be work subject to public use or concomitant to the provision of a public service. Infrastructure will usually be procured under public procurement rules using the principles of. Infrastructure is a fixed asset, it has a long life, and is a potential generator of cash flow in the long term, or it's available for use or the provision of a public service over the long term. Okay. So we have two kinds of infrastructure according to the guide, two major kinds of infrastructure. The first is economic infrastructure. Now that's typically network-based, so pipes, power lines, IT lines, linear infrastructure such as roads and rail and utility networks as well, if you think of those roads as being a network. Normally the user pays directly for the services through direct fees and tariffs. And then finally, social infrastructure, a facility that hosts public servants, officials, or hosts the provision of a social service. Typically, the government pays the service provider directly for the service. And usefully, the guide breaks down the elements into economic and social. Now, it just so happens that this is something which may be different in different countries. So you may not break them down in quite the same way. The economic area has transport, roads, rail, and other ports and airport. Then you have water and waste, energy, ICT and telecoms, tourism and agribusiness. Social, health, education, security, prisons, court, justice, social housing, sports, emergency response, government accommodation, and things like police and so on, but also anything that's to do with social service health issues tend to be on the social side rather than on the economic side. There may be breakouts from that, things like defense or civil defense, border posts, that kind of stuff. And we also have just accommodation. So you'll see that later on we might talk about government accommodation. Now, on the economic side, that energy, ICT, telecoms, tourism, and agribusiness, if you have national parks in some countries fall under social infrastructure, and in other countries economic infrastructure. So just be aware of these differences. So now we're going to talk about when to use PPPs, motivations and caveats. Now there are three major areas for motivations for using PPPs. The first is a financial mechanism. Use of private cash, access to that cash, when we wouldn't normally have access. Certainly, that was the reason, the raison d'etre for doing PPPs in the UK in the 1990s, because if we had tried to finance projects ourselves, we would have been, infrastructure projects ourselves, we would have been in breach of our agreements with the IMF. So the way around it was actually not to borrow, but to go to the private sector and ask them to deliver services. And in delivering those services, they constructed an asset, and that asset then could be handed back to the government at the end of the deal. So we've got the financial mechanism. The next one is a potential source of efficiency in projects. So more flexible cost management, Now, remember, there is a problem here. Basically, with every PPP contract, we are actually tying up the public sector budget for a number of years. For however many years that contract is in play, that money has to be paid out to the contract. So, in fact, we have greater rigidity of budgets. However, the private sector has more flexible cost management in the way that it's allowed to spend its money. So that's one of the benefits. By getting the private sector to do something, then they have got greater flexibility about the financial control. Plus, they are seeking a profit. So if they're seeking a profit, they're more likely to deliver the project to time and to budget. So some of the research that's been done has shown that about 75% of all government projects fail, or rather, depending on your definition of fail, but certainly they are late and they overspend. Whereas 75% of PPPs are delivered on time and within budget. Okay, we also are enforcing life cycle cost management on our processes, because the way the price is defined is by looking at the costs overall of the build and the maintenance cycle, and those costs are absorbed within the life cycle cost management. We also have risk transfer, innovation, reliability and effectiveness of project benefits, and better asset utilization. Now, other benefits relate to an upfront commitment of resources to maintenance and technical reliability, demonstration effects that show we've had the private sector doing something in a particular way, it worked, we can do it like that in the public sector. And then finally, you have those demonstration effects, and then finally you have transparency. And the rules around procurement and the rules for delivering a PPP are very much around transparency. So in terms of motivations, it provides financial flexibility, especially in EMDEs. Now, in EMDEs, emerging markets and developing economies, you have to think differently about delivering a PPP, because you have a different financial marketplace than other countries. So it's not saying that a PPP won't work, but it's looking for what they do and what they don't do. It provides financial flexibility, especially in those EMDEs. There's no need to allocate resource in budgets at the early stages. No need to include the bills in the Treasury Fund strategy at early stages. Transparent and accountable even when reported as a public debt. The finance is directly attributable to meet specific need, and then we can obtain finance for projects when finance for government may not be so attractive. So we have 9 disadvantages and pitfalls of the PPP option. First one is that PPP can be more complex than traditional procurements. That's true. PPPs have a higher transactional cost than procurement, traditional procurement. That's true. PPS have higher monitoring costs. So now this has been part of the government assessing, accessing the quality of service benefits of PPPs. It's also an absence of appropriate accountability and fiscal fiscal monitoring. PPPs can result in excessive budget commitments and threaten fiscal sustainability. Now, PPPs do appear more operational in terms of servicing. PPPs are far more expensive in terms of servicing the finance, but you can't judge the value on the cost of a single component. That's what it says here, and that's true, because the cost of finance is likely to be higher than if the government financed the deal, but we should be looking at those greater efficiencies and so on. And theoretically, those efficiencies should add up to more than the cost. So that's why we're doing this. So we've got rigidity, we've got lack of competition, we've got other particular failures here, which I'm not going to read out now. I'm just going to give you a minute or two to have a look at those. So let's think about that public perception, equating PPPs with new or increased user charges. A very well-known example is South Africa in about 2010 when they had the World Cup. So they decided that a quick way of renovating their roads would be through PPPs. So the first PPPs they did were new roads and renovating roads. Unfortunately, the public believed that, well, they'd always use these roads free of charge. And now they were going to have to pay a toll. And in fact, there was civil disobedience, and it went on for a number of years before there was actually any real resolution regarding this. So just be careful, because the public may think, yes, this was free, I now have to pay for it, I'm paying the government, therefore it is like an extra charge or an extra tax. Now, in order for a PPP project to be good and for you to access the benefits of it, there needs to be certain elements. Okay, so the project must be sensible, it must be suitable, it must be properly structured, properly tendered, and proactively managed through the life of the contract. So let's go through that again. It must be a sensible project, must be suitable, it must be properly structured, it must be properly tendered, and it must be proactively managed through the life of the contract. So before you get to the exam, make sure that you are comfortable with the wording in the guide around it being a sensible project, a suitable project, properly structured, properly tendered, and then managed through the life. So there is an issue around adapting the PPP approach to the macroeconomic context and financial market restrictions of any particular environment. However, the things that we need to think about is making sure that we have proper project governance in place. And then secondly, that we have appropriate frameworks in place that are relatively straightforward. We need good management of the project and competition in PPP procurement. And then obviously we need to address the market appetite. Okay. The other things that we need to think about are the country risk perception or availability of long-term finance in a particular country, budget restrictions and the financial capacity of government. And also we have a problem with local government because they normally, well, they have a bad history in terms of going bankrupt and the lights being switched off. And we've seen this in a number of cities in the UK for a number of reasons. And it can be an issue. Essentially, any city can go bankrupt, Manchester, Liverpool, New York, Chicago, and therefore they're perceived as not having sufficient money to do these deals, or maybe that they are the biggest authorities that can do the deals, so it limits what we're going to achieve here. So we need to be very, very careful. Okay, right. So with a conventional procurement, the government has to pay for construction as it progresses right from the beginning, but with a PPP, you don't. Sorry, I'm just looking. So there we have a conventional procurement, and with a PPP, there's no initial price. Okay, right. So you're now going to get a 15-minute break until on the hour, and then we'll continue through. So 15-minute break. Okay, so let's revisit the challenges for local government. So simply, they are smaller organizations within the jurisdiction of a nation, and they may not have sufficient finance. We've said that, you know, cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Chicago, New York have gone bankrupt in the past, and they're major cities, and therefore the private sector can be slightly nervous about working with them on major infrastructure projects. And the expectation will be that the central government will help with the projects. Now, in many countries, schooling, education is dealt with locally, but with PPPs, they may do a large number of schools in a project, and this will be, the actual project will be managed centrally. And then once the contract has been signed, they'll put in place some local arrangements to fit in with the normal management of schooling at a district level. So there can be difficulty accessing private finance with reasonable conditions. There obviously you get this increasing decentralization of power, but not necessarily the level of resources to complement that. There can be long-term commitments commensurate with revenue capacity. It can be difficult as well. And then also we need to make sure that the tariff levels are appropriate in a local environment, which can be difficult. And the risk perception could overstate real capacity. There is this concept in risk of what's called optimism bias. When we do our own projects, we tend to be more optimistic about the success of the project and underestimate the level of risk and the cost of risk. And yet this could be greater in a smaller area, or a smaller administration, where there are fewer staff with the requisite skills and so on. And then central government PPP policy management. So there may be some opportunities to support subnational governments, and also there could be control mechanisms to avoid excessive exposure. So, for example, a central government or a federal government may actually have rules governing national governments within the overall federation that limit the amount of infrastructure expenditure that can be undertaken by those authorities. Now, interestingly enough, that very restriction, that very constraint, means that it's often on the public money that's available to the those jurisdictions. So actually, in many of those authorities, they will go down the PPP route because it's a way of apparently circumventing those constraints. But obviously, all of these depend on specific jurisdictions and legislation rules that relate to those environments. Right, now we've got some recommendations regarding PPPs. Now, can I just say, obviously, this revision is to help to support you to pass the exam. I have no idea what the questions might be in your exam, but there are areas which come up quite frequently, and the areas that we're focusing on in this revision are those that come up most frequently. Now, to be fair, I can't tell you whether or not we're going to be covering off all the topics that will be in the exam, because that's not the intention. But what we can focus on those areas that you really do think about, you do need to think about and to cover, because if you don't, then you're missing out on a potential marks. Remember, you only need to get 25 marks in this exam out of 50, and you pass. If you answer 26 questions and you get 25 of them right, you've passed. You do not get negative marks as well. So if you've got 25 of them wrong and 25 of them right, you still get 25 marks. You don't get 0. So answer as many questions as you can. And remember that although I might cover a topic, only one question might, if any question at all, might come up in the exam on that particular topic. So let's talk about these main recommendations. The first one is emerging markets and developing economies and low-income countries and so on. They need to adapt the PPP strategy to their own political, social, and economic context under the principles of realism and prudence. Now, I do, separately from this, something called Making PPPs Happen. And it's about doing assessments in your own particular country about the likelihood of getting in the, will it be a successful PPP? Will we get to attract the right suppliers? Now, everybody always thinks yes when they're talking about their own country. But as soon as you show them another country, they'll do the assessment and they'll say, no, this other country won't get this, it won't have that. And yet, actually, that other country might be more likely to be successful at doing a PPP than the country that I've been talking about, let's say. So there is a problem because of this risk optimism that we were talking about before, because people always believe that things will go a lot better in their own country than might be the case, and that's because they overestimate or they the attraction to the private sector of their country to do infrastructure development. So there can be particular problems. Now, what I say is, look, it might be that any particular jurisdiction may have issues with a particular PPP. That doesn't mean to say you shouldn't do the PPP. What it means is that we have to look at doing the PPP differently and adapting it to that local environment. And when somebody comes into your country and says, but that's not how you do PPPs, you say, well, that might not be the standard way of doing a PPP, but we have designed it in this particular way to make it attractive to the market, to make it work with our population, whatever it might be. So part of that is selecting the appropriate projects, maximizing and protecting any inherent efficiencies that are there. Acknowledge the highly demanding resource requirements of a PPP. It's not cheap. It costs a lot more to transact for a PPP than it does for a conventional, traditionally procured project. In addition, it normally takes longer. And our first PPPs that we do should think of as being what we call pathfinder projects, where we put some extra resource in because there are things that we're going to have to consider which we've never considered before, and then that helps us to think about the detailed level of our PPP framework. We need to make sure that we assess or appraise projects in detail to ensure feasibility. I've been involved in projects where the level of appraisal has been very poor, and it's essentially being shown that a project could work, when even I, looking at it, could see that it wouldn't work and it required more appraisal, because actually it might be better done as a conventional project. And the guide actually says, you know, there will be kind of many projects that should be done as a conventional project because it doesn't suit the PPP environment. We need to dedicate resources to properly structure the tender and contract and to manage the process to procure maximum effective competition. We need to allow enough time for the procurement and to dedicate government attention and resources to manage the contract beyond procurement. Apart from the do's, we have the don'ts. So there was one country in sub-Saharan Africa that when I worked for the Crown Agents, we were supporting. And that country, we were giving them a lot of support. We were explaining how to do things. But politically, what we were suggesting didn't sound fast enough. It wasn't big enough for the president. So they got in another advisor who promised that they could do things a lot faster and a lot bigger. And within 6 months of us being thrown out and this new contractor being selected, this country announced that they were going to do 60 PPPs within the next 18 months. Now, this is farcical. A number of reasons. One, there weren't 60 advisors who could do this work. So who was going to advise at the right level of detail? Secondly, where were the contractors? Because there may be, you can launch a PPP tender, but all the contractors are busy. They're all busy building bridges, busy building schools, and so on. So you need also to be able to pay for them, or have the support of a multilateral development bank to help you pay for your contractors and to put money into the deal. So the idea that they were launching 60 PPPs, and you know what, they would be all signed off in 18 months, seemed a little bit unrealistic. And in fact, the market laughed at them. It was an embarrassment for the country. The contractor, of course, got away with it, and then continued and said it wasn't their fault. But this contractor had no real understanding of doing PPPs and just thought of them as being normal procurements being delivered in a conventional way. Now think about it. How long will it take you to write your first output-based specification for a road contract or for a school? Once you've written one, it becomes easier. But how easy is it the first time? What about a performance mechanism? Remember, the contractor will only be paid if they deliver according to the performance, if it's a government-based PPP. So who is defining that performance mechanism? Who's going to check that it works? All of these things need experience. They need to be part of a proper process of delivery. It doesn't take 5 minutes to do it. It can take a long time, particularly if they're the first project. It says here, don't use PPP for small projects. Now, that's a correct answer for the exam, but I actually worry about this because PPPs in the guide and elsewhere, they talk about the minimum value of a PPP being at least $100 million US. Why? Because putting a transaction together can be quite expensive, and the view is that it's only when it gets to $100 million US that you can offset that transaction cost. The problem is, it means that we tend to get the same suppliers bidding for the similar projects all the time, and it makes the market smaller and smaller and smaller. So when I was doing this course in Lithuania, they laughed at me when I said $100 million US, and they said their projects are more like $10 million US. But they still had them, but they were smaller. The financial market was smaller, and the costs associated with it were a lot more straightforward. Also, they didn't bundle schools together to make a big project, which is what you can do to make a bigger project with, you know, just the transaction costs associated with a single project. They actually kept them separate because it was easier to handle, to manage, and also that risk management was important to them. I personally also believe that we should be looking more at different kinds of PPPs, local PPPs, sustainable PPPs in local communities. Don't go for the big bang, the big expensive wastewater plant or a big energy plant. The small communities, let's look at setting up social enterprises, local companies to be able to, if not to install, certainly to manage local installations. Then maybe we'll have bigger PPPs for things that are done at the regional level, and then of course at the national level there will be those big projects, those big, the higher education institutes, the massive hospitals, the really good quality roads. But we can have lower quality roads if we want, smaller roads, narrower roads in local areas that can be maintained by local companies. And what about thinking around having clinics, multidisciplinary clinics with just 1 or 2 doctors locally, but facilities to go to off to a hospital somewhere else if required? What about having, instead of a local school, we introduced technology so we can effectively have a library where all the children come with a smaller number of staff who are there essentially to control the children, but otherwise the education might be provided remotely. So there are lots of different ways we can provide PPP, but that are not mentioned in this guide. So remember, in the guide it says don't use PPP for small projects. Don't use PPP because it's not accounted for as public debt. Do you remember I was telling you that certain national governments in a federal structure sometimes use PPP because it gets around that control total? Don't embark on a PPP process without the special or specific capabilities and resources needed. You need people who've really done PPPs before. Don't launch a PPP project until it's prepared. It says unless, but until it is prepared and assessed in economic, financial, commercial, affordability, and technical terms. Now, it doesn't say this here, and it's not for the exam, but remember also sustainability. That's really important. So social impact, environmental impact, but for the exam, it doesn't go into detail on those, so don't worry about those. So think for the exam: economic, financial, commercial, affordable, and technical. Right, what about, the problem is we could lose our value for money that we've assessed through inadequate structuring and unclear designing or drafting, so that the value for money we were expecting to get is not there. And at the same time, we shouldn't rush or set overly ambitious timelines. Now, this can be extremely difficult. If we have a president or politicians who want something to happen now, we tend to, in the end, have to give in because it's very difficult to not do what our leaders want. But the problem is that normally ultimately leads to failure, even with PPPs, because it means we've probably missed something. We haven't had enough time to negotiate the contract, something wasn't done properly, that type of thing. And then don't assume that the government has finished its job once the contract is signed. Actually, certainly for government-pays PPPs, we have to see that there is a lot of contract management and oversight, probably more contract management and oversight than with a conventional project. Why? Well, normally with a infrastructure, the public sector would be directly managing that infrastructure, but now it can only manage it through the contract, and its lever through the contract are the contract terms. So what we're talking about here is the performance mechanism and similar. So that means that we're at arm's length. So we have to keep making sure that we are are monitoring and evaluating that contract through life.